Hi everyone. This week I'm going to talk about King Arthur. So one of my main theories about Arthur is that he can be identified with Athrwys, the historical figure in the dynasty of southeast Wales. He was the son of Meurig, son of Tudrig. This is a theory that has been around for a very long time. I certainly didn't come up with it myself. It's been around since at least the 1700s. But one of the main objections to this theory is a matter of chronology. So the issue is that Arthur is generally placed in the 500s, whereas Athrwys is generally placed in the 600s. So if that's correct, then they could not possibly be identical. I believe, on the other hand, that actually Athrwys, son of Meurig, belongs to the 500s, and that he was actually an exact contemporary of Arthur. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 3 points that indicate that this is the case. The first point I've mentioned before in a previous video, but I'll just go over it again. So Tudrig, the grandfather of Athrwys, is identified explicitly as the same as Tudrig, the great-great-grandfather of St. Cadoc, in the record known as the Life of St. Cadoc. The Life of St. Cadoc presents a genealogy of Cadoc, and when it gets to Tudrig, it explains that he was martyred at Gwent and buried at Mathern, and that account is what happened to Tudrig, the grandfather of Athrwys, according to the Book of Llandaff. So it explicitly identifies Tudrig, the great-great-grandfather of Cadoc, with Tudrig, the grandfather of Athrwys. So if Cadoc was born in the early 6th century, as is universally believed, then Athrwys, who should be 2 generations earlier than him, cannot have been born anywhere near the 600s. He must have been born, even if Meurig, we suppose, was a late son of Tudrig, even in that case, Athrwys must have been born somewhere around the beginning of the 500s. He cannot have been born later than Cadoc, and Cadoc is universally agreed to have been born near the beginning of the 500s. So that's one piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence is from Athrwys' maternal grandfather. So Tudrig was his paternal grandfather, and his maternal grandfather was Gergenvaur. Now Gergenvaur is important because he was the grandson of a king called Pebio, or Pebio. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. Pebio, I think, or Pybio. It actually appears in a few different forms in the records, so there might be more than one way of pronouncing it. But anyway, so this Pybio, he has one son, Cynfyn, who then has the son Gergenvaur. So Pybio's grandson is Gergenvaur. He's the maternal grandfather of Athrwys. But through one of Pybio's other children, through his daughter actually, he has another grandson who appears as Dubricius. Now Dubricius was a very famous religious leader, and he is widely agreed to have been born in around about 465, or thereabouts, about 465. So as you can see, Dubricius and Gergenvaur were both grandchildren of this king Pybio. So they were first cousins, so logically they should have been born around about the same time, roughly. It's possible that they weren't, but with no preconceived ideas, we would expect them to have been born at about the same time. Now, if Dubricius was born in about 465, then logically Gergenvaur, his first cousin, would have been born in about 465 as well. So his maternal grandson, Athrwys, should have been born about 2 generations after that, which places his birth in around the early 500s, nowhere near the 600s. So that's the second piece of evidence. The third piece of evidence is to do with Oudoceus. Now he was a bishop who was active prominently in southeast Wales, and he interacts with the kings of southeast Wales in many records. For example, he, at the start of his tenure as bishop, the reigning king is Meurig, and then after him he actually appears as a contemporary of quite a few kings until you get to the great-great-grandchildren of Meurig appearing as witnesses to some of the land grants that he was involved in, right at the end of his tenure as bishop. So Meurig must have been quite old, and Oudoceus must have been quite young at the start of his tenure as bishop, for him to have been able to have lived long enough to see the great-great-grandchildren of Meurig. So who was Oudoceus? Well, Oudoceus was the son of a king of Brittany called Boudic. Now Boudic was the brother-in-law of a saint called Tylo. Now Tylo is believed to have been born in about 500. Boudic as well is believed to have been born in about 500, and given that they were brothers-in-law, that makes sense. Now, Boudic's son, Oudoceus, logically would have been born somewhere between, let's say, 20 and 40 years later. 40 years at the most, you would think. I mean, it's possible that he could have been born later than that, but we shouldn't come to that conclusion unless there's a real active reason to believe that. So if he was born around 540 and he became bishop maybe 30 years later in about 570, then, as we just discussed, Meurig must have been quite old at that time, at the time Oudoceus started as a bishop. So Meurig must have been old by 570, so his son Athrwys must have already been born by that time. Otherwise, Oudoceus wouldn't have still been alive by the time that Meurig's great-great-grandchildren had become teenagers. So if Meurig was old by 570, then that agrees with a birth for Athrwys in about, well, the early 500s. But it completely does not, in any way, shape or form, match the 600s for Meurig and Athrwys. So those are three pieces of evidence that Athrwys actually lived in the 500s, and that he was born around the beginning of the 500s, and that he was definitely not born in the 600s. That being the case, he would have been a contemporary of Arthur, and therefore could have been identical to him. Now I know there are other objections to the theory, like etymological ones, but this is just a matter of chronology right now in this video. So those are three pieces of evidence that the chronology of this dynasty should actually be placed 100 years earlier than it generally is.